Okay, Anna, have we? Welcome everybody who's joining to the webinar today, Ethnobotany and the Secret Life of Plants with Claudia Ford. While we're waiting for everyone to enter in, you can take a moment and introduce yourself in the chat, to say who you are and where you're from. And when you go to introduce yourself, make sure it says to all panelists and all attendees, otherwise everybody can't see you. And at the end, the last 10 or 15 minutes, we'll open it up for questions. And so if you do have questions, please ask them in the Q&A rather than the chat, because that way it's easier for us to see them. So I'll go ahead and get started. So welcome again. And this series is part of the Ethnobotany series that is sponsored by the American Botanical Council and the Sustainable Herbs Program. And it's the second in the series. You can see earlier recordings on the Sustainable Herbs Program website. And in November 12th, we'll be speaking with Dr. Mark Plotkin about his work. And then in December, on December 7th, I think, I'm speaking with Nancy Turner and several other speakers about her research around the intersection of indigenous knowledge and scientific knowledge. There's more information on all of those on our website. And this series is also connected to our outreach for the Sustainable Herbs Program, Sustainability and Regenerative Practices Toolkit, which is a collection of best practices geared to move along the botanical industry to bring these practices more into their the work that they're doing. And the Ethnobotany series is really to tease open the ideas and the values at the heart of using plants as medicine. And my hope is really that it can go beyond just plants as commodities and just think about our relationship with the environment and learn from the really important work so many people are doing to broaden our understanding of plants and their role in the environment and transform the ways we're exploiting it. And these webinars are made available for free through the generous support both of the American Botanical Council members as well as the inaugural underwriters and donors for the Sustainable Herbs Program. So we thank all of you for that support. And so with that, I'll turn to the conversation today, which is with Dr. Claudia Ford. Claudia has enjoyed a career in international management, development, and women's health for over 3 decades. She holds a PhD in environmental studies, and she's on the faculty of State University of New York in Potsdam. She teaches ethnobotany, indigenous knowledge, and gender studies, international business, environmental justice, and environmental literature, both in classrooms and in workshops. She's a visual artist and a writer, and she's on the boards of the Soulfire Farm Institute and the Biodynamic Association. But to me, Claudia Ford, I first met her when she gave a workshop at the Women's Herb Conference, the New England Women's Herb Conference in 2017 or 18. And she began the workshop. She stood before an overflowing tent of women, and she began by reading, and this is quoting Claudia, "It is the taste of my mother's hair that I remember first," she read. "Many moons ago, yet it remains indelibly firm and sleek in my mouth. Like cedar, it smells as smoky as the morning breath in our hut." And then she continued with reading her writing of the story of Sky Woman falling from the sky. And then for the remainder of the workshop, she wove together her personal experience and storytelling with her research into the ways that knowledge about plants unfold in unequal systems of power. She wove in opportunities for us to draw on our own personal experience. And then in conclusion, she brought it all together, asking larger questions about the role of stories and histories what it might take to cross these histories, which are often marked by violence and so much inequities, and the role that plants have to offer in those border crossings. And so I'm thrilled to be able to speak with you today, Claudia, and welcome.
Thank you, and it's wonderful to be able to speak with you today. Thank you for that introduction.
Of course. So maybe to begin, could you talk, I don't know if your discipline is actually ethnobotany, but if you could talk about the work that led you into your research that falls under the label of ethnobotany.
Sure. And yeah, that's always a good question. What is my discipline? I'm kind of quintessentially a transdisciplinary thinker and academic and just person in the world. And that's been a problem or a challenge since I was really young. I have lots of interests and I've tried to pursue them and pursue them all with at least a little enough depth that the ones that I'm in the most often I can feel comfortable translating between different disciplines, which I think is the hallmark of working across disciplines. What first started me looking at what I call the secret life of plants, and that is definitely a nod to Stevie Wonder and that amazing album. What first got me in that direction was working as a women's health specialist and a midwife, which I started actually when I was a teenager. And so that was many moons ago. And I was working with other midwives in Northern California and herbalists and trying to understand the role of plant medicines and reproductive health. So that's kind of what first got me interested. And then many years later, after traveling around the world with my children and then coming back to the United States, I wanted to get a doctorate. I really loved being in school. And I was trying to tie together the kinds of things I had seen around the world with the way that women, especially because I was working in women's health mostly, the way that they used herbal medicines to help their families in some of the most poor situations. And literally we were in all of the major continents and I was working there. And I wanted to tie it together. And I actually came across a book by Fitgrit Burks called Sacred Ecology. And it was talking about indigenous knowledge. And it was the kind of book that not only did I enjoy it, but it sparked an argument in me about the way in which knowledge is transferred. And that what Professor Burks said was trying to define indigenous knowledge as the knowledge and the paradigms of people who have lived in one location for millennia, which in fact it is. But I come from a diasporic content, so that my people are indigenous to the African continent, but I live here. And so I was trying to understand, as I'm often trying to understand, what parts of my indigenous culture kind of overlap with or infuse my Western knowledge. And that's where the plants became interesting to me. I thought, well, let me see if I can follow the plants, the stories of the plants, and they can tell me how that knowledge, especially for reproductive health, transferred and moved between different cultures. Did Africans bring the knowledge with them, which we know the answer is yes? Did they talk to Native Indigenous Americans on this continent about the way they were using plants? And of course, the answer there was yes. And then there was also transfer of knowledge between African, Native, and European cultures who were bringing their knowledge from Europe. So that's really what started my interest in this.
And then can you continue? So then you began looking, how did you begin? How did you end up looking at these historical records of plants?
My doctoral thesis advisor, Dr. Alicia Maltz, suggested that I contact the Mashantucket Pequot Research Center on the reservation in Connecticut, because they have an amazing collection, absolutely stunning. And I did, and I was just really fortunate to be hosted for 18 months in the archives on the reservation there, and on the Mohegan Reservation, to do research in all of their documents, their collections. I was in a funny mood at the time, and I didn't want to talk to people or do any kind of qualitative studies. I just wanted to bury my head in the archives, in the books. And it was fascinating sitting there over that 18-month period, just continually looking up stories about plants. And it got to be where I really felt like the plants were leading me. I ended up with a database of over 600 plants that had been reported as being used for reproductive health. And I was concentrating on women's reproductive health as it was defined, in the 17th, 18th, 19th century. And of course, not all of that is translatable to what we know now, but that's what I was concentrating on, historical ideas of what it meant to be a woman, and also women's health issues. And the plants just kept popping up and telling me stories. Literally felt every time I was sitting there that they were guiding me and saying, here's something interesting, follow this. So that's really how I got deeper into that particular conversation.
Well, reading your dissertation, that I'm amazed at the level of detail and the plants, and to me, I was thinking of you sitting there documenting it all and what it would take, and the quality of attention and how you knew which stories to follow. And when I spoke with you about your work a few years ago, I asked which stories surprised you or what surprised you, and you said the cotton story. So.
Yeah, so I was sitting there, and I don't remember at what point in the research. And of course, I was really interested in what the enslaved both enslaved and free African Americans were doing with their knowledge about plants, because obviously they had come from cultures in West and Central Africa mostly that were richly steeped in the plant knowledge of their own cultures, and then brought here traumatized, and yet of course had to access the plants that were here. And they also brought some of their plant species with them. So I was really interested in that. And I started reading about cotton, and the cotton plant is one of those plants that it has, there are many different species of cotton that fall under the entire, kind of genus of cotton plants. And we can't totally tell where each one started. I mean, if you do genetic studies, which I do not, you could probably trace it back with a little bit more detail. But there's New World cotton, and there's cotton from South Asia, and it looks like there's cotton from parts of the African continent. So that even by the time we're looking at the time of the slave trade, the use of cotton was global and it was widespread. But we know cotton was single-handedly, the cotton crop, responsible for this very horrific escalation in enslavement. And what happened was that it was at the point in the trade where there was beginning to be some pushback about going to Africa and bringing people here to North America. And so when the cotton crop came up as economically viable, what the plantation owners did was change some of the laws so that enslavement became very much a homegrown thing, meaning here in the United States, so that people were born into perpetual slavery. And as much as people were being brought from Africa, there was a turn to institutionalizing slavery on and among the plantations themselves. So it's associated with some of the most traumatic moments in the history of African Americans on this continent. So of course I had an interest in it. And I was reading this, I started to come across on microfilm, for any of you who know what that is, these copies of newspaper articles from Canada, Scotland, and the UK. And they were having a conversation, doctors, often called surgeons, who were practicing obstetric medicine, although the terminologies were slightly different. And there was a conversation between the US, Canada, Scotland, and the UK about, one, the use of cotton to induce abortions. And so that stopped me right away. And I started doing some research. And in fact, both cotton root and cotton seed had been used traditionally for menstrual regulation. And so often if you take something enough that's used in that way, you can induce menses. And so that was fascinating to me, because it was being posited by the US plantation owners as an economic problem. And the doctors in Europe and Canada were trying to help solve this. And the languages, it was very hard to read. And there were times when I would just close books and leave. And the language that they use around these African women inducing abortions, it was very punitive. But then the other interesting part of this, and that came up, was the use of black haw, which is what it was called, as a common medicine then. And again, what's fascinating is common names and scientific names don't match, right? Not in history and not now. So I had to do a lot of digging around. But black haw was being used to reverse the effects of the cotton. And so you have, again, the doctors saying, well, if you use this plant, even if your slaves or your property had taken a medicine to induce an abortion, you can reverse it. And it stopped me in my tracks to actually read that and think about the implications of that, and think about, the plant, wow, yeah, I even now thinking about the plants themselves, because I really do feel like plants have sovereignty. And there's very powerful medicines. And there's a certain part of it that is neutral, in that we can use plants for good and we can use plants for evil. And in this case, it was an example of these nefarious uses of these beautiful plant medicines. And so, yeah, I wrote that up and really thought about that, and just, I was really, for quite a few weeks after discovering these conversations, speechless to think about the irony of that the plant that was most iconic of our suffering as enslaved Africans was also being used to alleviate that suffering because of all of the unintended pregnancies from rape and forced breeding. And then another plant was being used to reverse that.
Yeah. And so what, maybe, there's so much there, right? but it's the importance of history, right? And understanding, because as a young, budding herbalist, it can be very naive. I was very naive, about these plants and the uses, and they're often displaced from the source of the knowledge and the ways they've been used. So I'm curious your thoughts both about that, the importance of knowing the history, but also the task of learning about history when often the key voices aren't in the historical record.
Yeah, those are two great questions. I'll take the second one first. I mean, I recognized immediately that women and especially Indigenous and African women, were not going to be the ones writing about these materials. And so I was reading the reports mostly of white male anthropologists. Some of them were very good about recording almost verbatim from their sources. And their sources were largely Indigenous American women. So there was that closeness. And then wherever I could, I would find sources that were in the original voices. So Sansom Okum and who else? Ibari Cohosh, anybody who wrote about this who was not male and was not white, I definitely included their material in it. And I just realized that there's what's called a silence in the archives. And I tried to fill that silence by, first of all, acknowledging it, recognizing it, and saying what I'm reading is distorted by that silence. And then I used my creative side, because I am a writer and an artist. So I used my creative side to try to fill in the silences. And I wrote fiction, nonfiction, and poetry. And I was lucky enough to have a very understanding dissertation panel. I think they've recovered, who allowed me to include those as sources. Because the argument I made was, I'm writing about Indigenous knowledge, and story is not entertainment in our cultures. It's not Hollywood, it's not movies. Stories is methodology. And so I was able to make the argument that including stories was just really an important part of helping to fill in these silences. And that's what the story that I shared with you was, the Indigenous story from this part of the world of Sky Woman or Falling Woman. I should add there that some stories in Indigenous, especially in Native cultures, here are open to the public for use, and some stories are sacred. And the bigger truth is that the stories that are really sacred knowledge will not be shared with us. But there will be some where we may be asked to keep that to ourselves, and others that are generally available to humanity and available to us. So these were very much my interpretations, but I also wrote my own original material. So that was one question.
Before you, I have
Yes.
the other one, but I wanted to follow up on that with one thing, because that also struck me when you talked about listening to the silence in the archive, and what it takes in you as a researcher to be able to hear that. You know, there can be this drive to gather knowledge, document what's there, and that I feel like the sitting back and different quality of doing research, if you could talk about that, and storytelling, it maybe connects with that too.
Right. As you were asking the question, the first word that popped up is humility. You know, and as a Black woman, a Black American woman, in this subject position that I have never asked for, but was just handed me as a condition of my birth into this society, I'm at the bottom of the rung of every single ladder. So I've always had to kind of look up in that sense, you know, from this bottom subject position, not an internalized bottom, but you know, the way the society sees me. And so I've never had the luxury or privilege to pretend that I know everything. And so I'm well aware that I don't. And so I think the first thing was just recognizing that my knowledge is limited. And I really have to understand and try to, respect the knowledge that is being presented, but it's always in a cultural context. maybe another way you could look at that is that, especially as a Black American, I live in what Du Bois calls double consciousness. And so I'm always in kind of these hypervigilant two-world kind of thing. And, you know, I don't want to go way off on a tangent about the whole frame of double consciousness, but it is really interesting if you want to look that up. And it just gives me a unique position as a researcher and as an academic. I think I just bring something unique to the table, also being Black and female.
I think trying to get back to the question also, because it all connects, but as thinking of that also, when you were talking about being in the moment of the birthing room and how that, you know, thinking of there are these different cultural roles, and then there's this liminal moment, and maybe could you talk about that, and then we'll get to the history one.
Okay, great. Yeah, so that came from my own experience, starting to be attending childbirth at age 20 and watching, and I was doing home births, so of course that was a particular culture, and I was learning from other midwives, and I was watching what goes on in the birthing room, and especially, you know, these were fortunately natural births, which not all of them, you know, not all births are, but fortunately for us, we had what's called a low risk practice. And so as I'm going through these experiences, I'm just observing this childbirth as this liminal space, and as this space where certainly all the people who were there in attendance were communicating in this really coordinated way for the outcome for the mother and the child. Like there was just this real focus. And so I went back and looked at whatever research I could find about childbirth, and then also imagined myself in those spaces. And then the research does back it up, because slavery was an economic venture. The plantation owners and their wives kept fairly detailed records about what was going on. And so you do see that within the birthing room, you could have a variety of attendants, variety of midwives. You might have the local Native American woman who is the midwife. You might have one of the slaves who is the midwife on a plantation or within a geographical area. And so right away I knew there, well, this is going to be a site where people exchange information. And because at that time, 1800s, 1900s, childbirth was far more difficult and dangerous than it is now, people would be paying attention if they saw an outcome that was healthy and successful. And once that information was out there in that space, it would, you know, be shared across other spaces. So that was really fun for me to look at it that way and realize that I had a contemporary experience that doesn't map completely, but it allows me to kind of enter that room in my imagination and create some stories that could go on there.
Well, and then, so there's this moment of information passing, knowledge, and then people go back to their role in that setting as plantation owner or slave. And that's where, right, knowing the history and political economic inequities comes in. So, so now I'd love your thoughts about what does knowing the history do? Why is it important?
Well, I think I just learned something yesterday that I want to share. I told you earlier, and I'm in a conference right now talking about sacred plants, psychedelic psychotherapy and psychedelic plants. And some of the same questions are coming up. But one of the things that an indigenous elder said is we should stop saying we use plants, because nobody likes to be used. Yeah. And it made me stop for a minute and say, yeah, right. since I subscribe to the sovereignty of the plants, which is a concept that Robin Wall Kimmerer talks about and has, taught me, that I don't want to use the plants, they are my friends. And so how can we use different language there, right? And I think he was also talking about gifting and receiving and other terminologies that we could use. And I say this because I think acknowledging the history or the story of the plant medicines does two things. It acknowledges the plants themselves so that we're not using them in this purely, using them in this purely transactional way. And we're not relying on them purely for their chemical uses, because most of us know that the chemistry, as powerful as it is not the only, or maybe not even the major part of the healing. It's the relationship that happens between that plant in all of its wholeness and an individual's physiology and emotional and spiritual being. And Stephen Foster and James Duke, and these are people who've also talked about that, that I've had the pleasure to learn from. So I think the history is important for that acknowledgement of the plant itself. And then the other is for the traditional knowledge and customs and ceremonies that from which this knowledge comes. And one thing that we don't do enough of is give credit to that. And sometimes people will say, well, does that mean we can't use it because it was used by an indigenous culture? And the answer to that is no, that's not what that means. I like to think of Western academics, because I am an academic and that's a particular point of view. But what we do is we cite our sources. And what we're doing is we're acknowledging. It doesn't mean we're not using them. We use them for our own ideas. We put them together in different ways, but we give people the respect of saying, I'm saying this great thing, but I learned it from all these other people. And I think sometimes when we're doing herbalism or we're talking with plant medicine, we forget to do that. We forget to credit the source of the materials. That's a simple thing to do, but it's so powerful. It's such a measure of respect. So it's that respect to the plant, and it's respect to the people who maybe formed some of the initial relationships with that plant.
And it also makes me think of, thinking of how they were used on slave plantations, and cotton as, being the reason for bringing slaves to America in the first place. And many of the plants currently used were used in the colonial trade, which, we all know the devastating impacts that has had. And so, but that often isn't talked about in the current discussions about, say, using plants as medicine. And so I also think about that history, and then what to do with that history in a way that doesn't become too oppressive, right? Of guilt, and how to acknowledge it and move forward.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I think that's a collective conversation that we're having now, and goes into decolonization more widely, and the moment we're in right now, having these difficult discussions about race, and really trying to recognize that what I often say is, guilt is not the worst thing in the world. Shame, I'm not so much into, but I know when I feel that twinge of saying, ugh, that it actually sparks me to change. And that's what we're trying to do right now. We're saying the oppression that marginalized people are under, which right now is right in our faces, especially in this society, is not okay. It is just not okay. And it's been going on for a long time, and people are saying we have to stop it. But in order to get to that change of stopping it, we have to be uncomfortable. we can't run from the discomfort of it. So the discomfort of the story around cotton and the way in which it made slavery in the United States worse, and then the way that, you know, the enslaved women were being raped and trying to use this for their own agency, that's an uncomfortable story, but it's one that we must hear. We really must hear that story. And that will spark us to think more deeply in a more nuanced way about what we're doing with our own practices, and start thinking about health justice and the way that even today, the infant and maternal mortality rate in African American and Native American communities is equivalent to the worst in the world. And the difference right within this country is, it's unconscionable. And so for me, it's like, keep that history in mind, because this didn't start from nowhere, that we're in this current situation. If we ignore that history, we can't change what's right in front of us. So for me, the history is also very much tied to justice. And in the conference I'm in, we're talking about mental health justice and the way that psychedelic plants are being used, but they're being used primarily in white communities. In these clinical trials are 98% white and only 2% African American. And so what we're going to have is a psychedelic renaissance and mental health justice. And just like in the environmental field, they're going to start going in different directions, which really, we can't let that happen. There's no reason for that to happen.
Yeah, thank you for all that. And actually the conversations with you and reading your work led me to dig into my own past for that discomfort to sort of, so I completely agree. And it's been helpful to open my eyes. And then what you were talking about, health, you know, the divorce of the plants and health justice, made me think about the ways Indigenous knowledge, and you talk about this in your work, Indigenous knowledge can be narrowly described as being more moral or sacred, and raised in what are kind of static terms, ahistorical terms, that don't do justice to the reality of people's lives, the reality, the nuance and complexity of the knowledge itself, how it's changing. I wondered if you have thoughts about that.
Yeah, I think that we do a disservice when we do especially in the environmental field, we talk about the environmentally noble Indigenous person and, you know, the morality of that worldview. And yeah, that's so not fair. And especially because it's kind of comparing Western notions of morality and religion and ethics with a system that didn't even look at it that way. So in Indigenous cultures, and I'm generalizing here because each one is very specific, but more broadly, the worldview is holistic. There is no such thing as religion here and ecology here and, you know, medicine here, and they are one way of being in right relationship. And that's not true for the West, where we have disciplines and, you know, dualism, and things are nature or man or culture, or you know, it's much more atomized, it's much more divided. So it's hard to see across into the other paradigm. But I think what has happened is that paradigm encompassing everything and all of it being in relationship to source, to spirit, and all of it being about right relationship between the different elements, means that of course it's more moral, because it's not built on separation. So yeah, it's sometimes hard to talk about because I hate to say comparing apples to oranges, but I think you know what I mean. We're comparing two systems that were really quite different from each other, using one to try to describe the other. And the more that I traveled, you know, I had this great fortune to travel around the world with my children, something that, you know, I just feel so lucky to have been able to do. It was partially because of the moment of time, and, you know, partially, you know, my choices, and partially because I have this amazing family and my 4 children are just awesome. And so we really had incredible experiences together. And what I saw from doing that, and not only being in these countries, but immersing myself there, putting my children in school, really having to be way more than a tourist. But I also always understood that I wasn't from there. And I was getting a peek, a window into somebody else's culture, often quite different from my own. And I really got to see how hard it was sometimes for me to immerse myself in somebody else's paradigm and way of doing things. And it took a lot of patience, and probably more on my adopted family's part, and a lot of humility to just put myself in that position where I didn't understand. And I had to just recognize that and keep trying. And there were definitely moments where I would break through that paradigm wall and be able to remove what had been inculcated in me from birth. But it was often hard. And I think in fact, the first 2 speakers you had, was it Mark and
Mike Ballard and Paul Cox.
Yes, we're talking a little about that, you know, moments in the field. And I was giggling because if the worst thing that happened to them is that they were embarrassed and got laughed at because they were performing at the level of children. And the reason I was giggling was because, you know, I'm traveling and doing this as a single mother and a Black woman. So I had way worse embarrassments than that. And yet maybe also I had more access because I was traveling as a woman of color into, you know, these villages in South Asia and East Africa. And I often brought my children with me to the field. And so in would come, you know, a person who's representing the donor agency, and I'm carrying a 3-year-old on my hip. And I think it was also at the same time it was opening. And I, again, thank my children for allowing me to not only experience the world, but to experience it through their eyes.
There's so much in what you've talked about. A thing I was thinking as you were talking in the beginning, again, it's a way of thinking about stories, because stories, you know, I remember reading books to my children and I loved them so much more than, you know, most books, especially in academics, because they were a story and the individual characters took the lead. And then the ideas were through those stories of individual people. And there's not those separations. I wanted to refer to one of the questions because it builds on what you were just talking about doing your research. It's by Flora Costume. Hello, Dr. Claudia. Thank you for your work and your generosity. As a young Black person, I often find it hard to stay in historical texts and research because I find it so hard to take in. How have you maintained your vigor in your fields of study throughout your career?
Wow, thank you for that question. And so much loving energy goes out to you for continuing to try. Yeah, I mean, history has been written so much by the victors, you know, that saying, if the lion wrote the story of the hunt instead of the hunter. And so I feel like one thing that keeps me going is seeking out the alternative histories. I mean, that's part of why I do this research, is because I want to find out what is the history that we're given, and then where where's that missing? What's the real history, right? So I'm actually driven by uncovering what's underneath what we are given. That's what feeds me, if you will, to keep going. Because often what we are given glorifies this oppressive narrative. It glorifies the colonizers and the settlers, even in contemporary work. And, you know, I was criticizing one of my colleagues for writing a book that was basically the history of something, and it was the history of white men doing it, period, as if the rest of the world just didn't exist. And that's one of the myths of white supremacy, is that we normalize this basis of expertise and we don't question it. And so for me, I keep going by saying, well, okay, that's great, but what's missing? And it drives me to my academic work, especially, to find those sources, to find out what's missing, to see if I can wiggle through the cracks. And that makes me less depressed about the history that I am reading. The other thing, of course, is just to work with other people who are like-minded, especially people of color, but any people who are doing similar work of decolonizing the stories. Yeah, and you know, stories here has a bad rap because we immediately think of Hollywood. We immediately think of entertainment, right? Our entertainment industry has kind of taken over our idea of what stories are, but that's like so limited, that stories are so rich. And I come from a story culture where I was fortunate enough to have a grandmother who would put me to sleep from infancy by telling me traditional Southern stories about Brer Rabbit. And you know, that I didn't know anything else. It was all oral. And then my mother was a teacher, so stories were everything for her. And they were far from entertainment. They were lessons. They were teaching me ways to behave, which I didn't learn that well, but they tried. And so, yeah, a story is the method, it's the methodology. It really, we know from brain research that we are all programmed for the structure of narrative, and that it's a part of our paradigm, it's a part of our worldview.
Again, so many things I could follow up on. I wanted, the one thread I want to, because it allows me to weave in another question. As you were talking about stories, and this question by Gita Mathur, please share with us what you have learned about the secret life of plants. And I think that's a story, there's a part of story unfolding in that too. And I'm curious what your thoughts are, both maybe the secret life of plants in historical research, but also in your work now when you work with plants in a not textual way.
Sure. And if you have never heard the Stevie Wonder album, this is definitely a plug, to have a really wonderfully relaxed day and listen to it. It's one of the albums among many that made him a genius, and it's not one that's often referred to. Well, I think what I was talking, the secret life of cotton, right, was exactly the stories that I uncovered. That was its secret life. That was something that none of us knew about, the very clothing that we're wearing, right? That we might have known about the slave trade, but we didn't know the secret life of that plant. The same thing with black haw. We didn't realize the secret life of that plant. Blue cohosh is another one that I talk about, which is very well known even now in the women's reproductive health field. But when you go back and read about this kind of madness that was happening around blue cohosh, and I wrote an article about this recently because it defined this difference in paradigm between childbirth as seen here on the North American continent and childbirth in Europe in the 17 and 1800s when these cultures were clashing, were coming together in these really fraught ways. And the ship's doctors were observing, because many of them were herbalists, and they were observing but not knowing what they were seeing, which was that Indigenous women did not suffer the same way that their women did in childbirth. They then interpreted that to be partly responsible because of blue cohosh, which especially in where I am, I'm in the northeast part of the United States, in this part of the world especially, was being given across different tribal groups in the last stage of pregnancy and into the first parts of labor. And they attributed the outcome, especially the way it affected the mother, to this herb. What they missed in that attribution, well, first of all, yes, there's no question that blue cohosh causes a coordination of the rhythms of the contractions of the uterus that is beneficial. And we, even now, and I am not recommending people use this without talking to a specialist, but even now we know that blue cohosh has some really beneficial effects on the uterus. But what they missed was two really important things. First, they missed that they were using ergot, which is a fungus of rye, and which has effects on the uterus. But although they had been told by European midwives not to use it for childbirth, they were using it to rush childbirth with these horrendous effects, killing mothers and babies, because the ergot causes massive contractions and not beneficial contractions. So they hadn't quite figured that out. And the other thing is that they were dealing with these two totally different paradigms about religion. So you have a religion, a Christian religion, which is punishing women specifically for leaving the garden and saying you will labor in pain, such that psychologically European women were entering childbirth expecting to die and getting their last rites and expecting to be in pain. And that didn't exist here. That wasn't it at all. We don't know exactly, but what's mostly been said is that it was a rite of passage. And rites of passage can be difficult, but they're not designed for you to die, whereas the European idea of childbirth was literally a life and death ordeal. So that's the secret life of blue cohosh, right? This really interesting story about clashing paradigms and taking a plant somewhat out of context, even though it does have beneficial effects.
Thank you. And the way you answered it illustrated the point you just made about story, the wholeness of knowledge. We're coming to the end of the hour, and there's one question that ties in with what I wanted to ask as my last question, which was relating to the current work that you're doing. You mentioned you're looking at the decolonization of herbal knowledge and ethnobotany, and the question is from Stephen Foster, and he asked if you could speak to the subject of decolonization and understanding the concept.
Great. Hi, Stephen. So nice to know that you're here. In fact, every once in a while I'm getting distracted by the chat because I see so many of my friends here. So thank you. Well, decolonization is, talks about colonialism, and colonialism is not a moment. It's kind of an ongoing structure. And decolonization is this attempt to reverse all of the systems of domination and disconnection and exploitation and extraction that have been part of the settler cultural norms and have caused us to be disconnected from each other and from the natural world. So for me, decolonization is about reversing that. And part of the action of doing that is to correct history, to make history fuller and more accurate. But the whole process of decolonization is about reversing the social norms that came in with colonialism and continue with settler mentality, and we're so destructive of our connections. And I really think that is both connections to people and connections to earth. And we're trying to heal those. So for me, decolonization is part of that process.
And specifically now, your new book idea around decolonization and herbal medicine, or maybe that's a secret, but
no, not a secret.
specific to add about that.
Yeah, I do think that I would like to take this conversation and broaden it and really get it down on paper and really look at kind of a new way, history of looking at plant medicines, and including sacred plant medicines, as they're called. To me, all plant medicines are sacred, but we do recognize that entheogens have a very special role to play in our system of plant medicine. So I've been collecting these stories, and I want to gather them together so that I can share them. So.
Well, fantastic. Do you have any final points that you want to add before we close?
No, I wish I could stay on and answer everyone's questions and have this giant conversation with a couple hundred people. It'd be fabulous, and hopefully I will. And yeah, just sending so much love out to everybody. And we're so lucky to have co-evolved with the plant world. We are just, I sometimes can't imagine how thankful I am for that co-evolution, and for all my teachers, many of whom are here today, to Deb Soul, and to Amanda and Mandana, and just to everybody, just how blessed I am, and of course to my grandmother for teaching me the wisdom, the knowledge that plants are so important, and that we've co-evolved with them in a way that they will help us and continue to help us. And then the other things, just for everyone to be super careful. Yes, we're in this really tough societal moment that requires all of us to work together, to look out for each other, to protect each other, and to recognize that we're going through, as midwives say, we're going through transition. Transition is a really, really tough time. It is uncomfortable. It does hurt. It can be scary, but we're midwifing each other within our communities to get through this moment. And I'm really hopeful that we're going to get through it and get to something that's really joyful, that we really do give birth to new ways of being with each other. So thank you, everyone.
Thank you so much.
Yeah.
It was beautiful.
Thank you, Anne.
Yeah, there have been some questions about the names of your books.
They're coming. They're coming
soon.
Yeah.
But Claudia does have a recent article in the American Herbalist Guild Symposium Journal, right? And then if you look on, or you can say where people can find more about your work, or maybe be at conferences you're speaking at.
Yeah, and the TEA blog also has a recent article that talks about my grandmother and her use of plants. So yeah, I think if you look me up on the internet, you will see some of those. You can also, I'm very easy to find at Potsdam. I'm not wanting to be inundated with emails, but I will respond as quickly as I can. And especially if you're a younger person doing research, I like to encourage that. So next conference I will be at is the Biodynamic Association conference. I'm doing a workshop there. So you can look that up also, Biodynamic Association 2020 conference. It's entirely online. And yeah, I'll be doing some work there looking at farming and climate change and covering some of these issues about indigenous knowledge and farming and regenerative farming and plant medicine. So
great. Well, thank you so much. And again, thank everyone for joining us today, and thank you for the questions. And I'm sorry we couldn't get to them all. And we'll have follow-up. We'll share this material online. There'll be a recording, and we'll send you the link, and I'll send links to points that Claudia has mentioned in the conversation. And then just one,
Will you save the chat, Anne?
Yes, the chat will be saved.
Oh, excellent. Good.
And
Claudia
then
to say hi.
and I'll send you the link. Our next webinar, we're having one on November 19th from 2 to 3 p.m. on Thursday. And this is part of the Sustainable Herbs Program Toolkit. And I'll be speaking with Sebastian Pohl from Pucka Herbs and Tal Johnson from Herb Farm around the work they've done to really build culture and values within an organization around caring for a lot of the ideas that Claudia's mentioned in this conversation, so that it's not just set of practices and ways to meet goals of a company, but it's kind of the life force of a company. So that's going to be that conversation. And that's all for now. So thank you all so much for joining us today. Thanks.
Bye. Thank you, Anne.
Thank you, Claudia.